Every history textbook in the Western world lists a single year as the birth of the modern age, 1440. You are taught that in a small German workshop, a blacksmith named Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press. You are told he created movable type, mass-produced the Bible, and single-handedly dragged humanity out of the dark ages of handwritten manuscripts. It is taught as the ultimate spark of the information age. It is framed as the moment Western genius unlocked the sum of human knowledge. But the buried record reveals a massive chronological lie. Johannes Gutenberg did not invent the printing press. He did not invent movable type. He was simply the first European to figure out what the East had been doing for over 400 years. This is the buried record, and today, we are peeling back the layers on the Gutenberg Illusion and the 400-year cover-up of the printing press. What follows is the story they absolutely do not want you to know. If you are the kind of person who questions what you have been taught, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe. We dig into buried records like this every single day. Let us start with the official timeline, the version of intellectual history you were tested on in school. The year is 1440. Europe is trapped in the intellectual stagnation of the Middle Ages. The written word is incredibly rare, incredibly expensive, and completely controlled by the elite. If you want a book, a monk has to sit in a freezing stone monastery and copy it by hand, letter by letter, page by page. It takes months, sometimes years, to produce a single volume. Because of this, knowledge is locked away. The average person is entirely illiterate. Information moves at the speed of a walking horse. And then, according to the standard textbook narrative, a miracle of European engineering occurs. Johannes Gutenberg, a brilliant goldsmith in Mainz, Germany, has a sudden stroke of absolute genius. He realizes he can carve individual letters out of metal, arrange them in a frame, cover them in ink, and press them onto paper. He adapts a wooden wine press, creates a specialized oil-based ink, and prints the Gutenberg Bible. The narrative is clean, heroic, and entirely Eurocentric. We are taught that this single European invention sparked the Renaissance. It ignited the scientific revolution. It allowed the Protestant Reformation to spread. It is the undisputed catalyst for the modern Western world. The West takes absolute global credit for inventing mass communication. This narrative is incredibly powerful. It reinforces the deeply ingrained idea that the major leaps in human technology, the true paradigm shifts, only happen in the workshops of Europe. But if you actually dig into the historical archives, if you look past the borders of the Holy Roman Empire, that beautiful narrative completely collapses. To understand the sheer scale of the historical theft, you have to look at what the rest of the planet was actually doing, while European monks were slowly copying Latin Bibles in the dark. The true timeline of mass communication does not begin in 15th century Germany. It begins centuries earlier, thousands of miles to the east. Long before Gutenberg was even born, the East had already solved the problem of mass-producing the written word. Look at the Tang dynasty in China. The Chinese had already invented paper, a technology that Europe would not fully adopt for centuries. But they didn't just invent the canvas, they invented the press. By the early 7th century, Chinese artisans had perfected the art of woodblock printing. It was a massive, highly complex undertaking. An expert carver would take a solid block of wood and meticulously carve an entire page of text and illustrations in reverse. They would apply ink to the raised characters, lay a sheet of paper over it, and apply pressure. It sounds labor-intensive, but once the block was carved, you could print thousands of copies in a matter of days. The buried record provides absolute, physical proof of this Eastern supremacy. In 1900, in a sealed cave in Dunhuang, China, archaeologists discovered a printed document. It is a Buddhist text called the Diamond Sutra. It is beautifully printed, highly detailed, and features a complex frontispiece illustration. It is not a crude prototype. It is a masterpiece of mass communication, and it has a date printed right on it, the year 868 AD. Think about that chronological gap. The Diamond Sutra was printed nearly 600 years before Gutenberg ever touched a printing press. While Europe was stumbling through the early Middle Ages, struggling to preserve basic literacy, the Chinese were mass-producing complex religious texts, agricultural manuals, and government decrees. They were printing paper money. They had playing cards. They possessed a thriving, highly literate commercial publishing industry. The light of the information age had already been switched on. But the Western textbook simply ignores this. The standard defense of Gutenberg is that woodblock printing doesn't count. Western historians argue that carving a whole page into a single block of wood is not true printing. They claim that the true genius, the real paradigm shift, was the invention of movable type, the ability to rearrange individual letters to print any page you want. They claim Gutenberg invented that specific, revolutionary concept. But the buried record reveals that even this specific defense is a complete, manufactured lie. Gutenberg did not invent movable type. The East had already beaten him to that too. And they didn't just beat him by a few years. They beat him by 4 centuries. The year is 1040. We are in the middle of the Song dynasty in China. This is an era of massive economic and technological explosion. And in this incredibly advanced society, an artisan named Bi Sheng makes a leap of logic that will permanently alter the trajectory of human history. He realizes that carving an entire solid block of wood for every single page is highly inefficient. If you make a single mistake, you have to throw the entire wooden block away. So, Bi Sheng decides to break the language down into its individual components. He takes sticky clay and carefully carves thousands of individual Chinese characters. He fires them in a kiln until they are hard as stone. He then takes an iron plate, covers it with a mixture of pine resin, wax, and paper ashes, and begins arranging his clay characters into exact sentences and paragraphs. He heats the iron board until the resin melts, locking the characters perfectly in place. Once the page is printed, he simply reheats the board, removes the clay characters, and reuses them for the next page. This is the exact, undeniable definition of movable type. Bi Sheng invented it 400 years before Johannes Gutenberg was even born. The Western textbook completely ignores Bi Sheng. If he is mentioned at all, it is as a brief, irrelevant footnote. The standard defense of the Eurocentric timeline is to immediately move the goalposts. When Western historians are confronted with Bi Sheng's clay type, they argue that clay is too fragile. They argue that wooden type, which the Chinese also developed, warps and swells when it absorbs ink. The defenders of the Gutenberg myth will look you straight in the eye and say, yes, maybe the East had the concept, but Gutenberg's true, undisputed genius was inventing metal movable type. He used a durable metal alloy. That is what made the printing press a world-changing machine. But the buried record is absolutely relentless, because even this highly specific, carefully constructed defense is a complete fabrication. The East did not stop at clay, and they did not stop at wood. They mastered metal, and they did it long before Gutenberg ever set up his workshop in Germany. To find the true birthplace of the modern information age, we have to move to the Korean peninsula. The year is 1377. We are in the Goryeo dynasty. Over 60 years before Gutenberg prints a single page of his famous Bible, Korean Buddhist monks are hard at work inside the Humdeok Temple in the city of Cheongju. They are undertaking a massive printing project, but they are not using fragile clay. They are using highly advanced, precisely cast bronze. The Koreans had developed a brilliant system of metallurgy to solve the exact problems that Western historians claim Gutenberg solved first. They used a complex sand casting method. They would carve a character in wood, press it into perfectly packed, fine sand to create a negative mold, and then pour molten bronze into the impression. This allowed them to create thousands of identical, highly durable metal characters that would never warp, never swell, and never shatter under the pressure of a press. And they did not just theorize about this, they actually did it. In 1377, using this advanced cast metal movable type, these Korean monks printed a massive, multi-volume document containing the essential teachings of Zen Buddhism. The document is called the Baegun Hwasang Chorok Buljo Jikji Simche Yojol. Today, it is simply known as the Jikji. The Jikji is not a myth. It is not a rumor written in an obscure historical ledger. It is a physical, undeniable object. It is the oldest surviving book in the world, printed with metal movable type. And you can go see it right now. It is currently sitting in the vaults of the National Library of France in Paris, standing as absolute physical proof that the West did not invent the modern printing press. Think about the sheer engineering complexity required to print the Jikji. The Koreans did not just have to invent the metal type. They had to invent an entirely new chemical composition for their ink. Traditional Eastern inks were water-based, designed to soak into wood blocks. But if you put water-based ink on a smooth bronze character, it simply beads up and rolls off. The ink will not stick to the metal. So, the Korean artisans had to experiment and develop highly specialized, oil-based inks that would adhere perfectly to the bronze type and transfer cleanly to the paper. This is the exact same chemical problem that Gutenberg is universally praised for solving in the 1440s. The Western textbooks dedicate entire chapters to Gutenberg's brilliant invention of oil-based ink. They completely ignore the fact that Korean chemists had already solved the exact same problem generations earlier. The East had mapped out every single step of the mass communication revolution. They invented the paper. They invented the concept of the press. They invented movable type. They invented the metal alloy, and they invented the chemical ink required to make it all work. They possessed the complete, fully functioning architecture of the information age. So, how does a blacksmith in Mainz, Germany, suddenly replicate this highly complex, multi-layered Eastern technology in 1440? The traditional Western narrative asks you to believe in a massive, miraculous coincidence. They want you to believe that Johannes Gutenberg, completely isolated from the rest of the world, woke up one day and independently invented the exact same metal casting process, the exact same movable type concept, and the exact same oil-based ink that the Koreans had already perfected. They frame it as a spontaneous spark of isolated European genius. But human history does not work in isolated vacuums. Technology does not miraculously appear out of thin air. It travels, it is traded, and sometimes it is quietly absorbed and rebranded. To understand how the printing press actually arrived in Europe, we have to look at the massive geopolitical shifts happening in the 13th and 14th centuries. We have to look at the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen, the Mongol Empire. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols conquered a massive swath of the planet, stretching from the eastern shores of China all the way into Eastern Europe. The Mongols were brutal conquerors, but they were also brilliant administrators. They established the Pax Mongolica, a period of unprecedented stability and highly protected trade routes across the Eurasian continent. For the first time in human history, the East and the West were directly, heavily connected. And it was not just silk and spices moving along these massive trade networks. It was technology. It was information. European merchants, missionaries, and diplomats were suddenly traveling deep into Asia. Men like Marco Polo were walking through the streets of Chinese cities, witnessing technologies that defied European comprehension. And what were the Mongols doing with the printing technologies they conquered? They were aggressively weaponizing them for empire building. The Mongols actively embraced the Chinese and Korean printing systems. They used movable type to mass-produce government decrees, agricultural manuals, and most importantly, paper currency. The Mongol Empire ran on printed paper money, and European merchants were interacting with that printed currency every single day along the Silk Road. Printed playing cards, printed religious images, and printed paper money were flowing directly from Asia into the ports of Venice and Genoa. Europe was being absolutely flooded with physical evidence of Eastern printing technology. The concept of mass-produced, mechanically printed images and text was highly visible to any educated European merchant or artisan in the decades leading up to Gutenberg. The idea that Europe was completely unaware of Eastern printing is a deliberate historical blindfold. They saw the printed paper, they understood the concept, and it is highly probable, given the massive flow of trade and diplomatic missions, that the actual mechanics of movable type were described, documented, and carried back to Europe along these exact same trade routes. Johannes Gutenberg was not a divine inventor operating in a vacuum. He was a highly skilled metallurgist, living in a continent that was actively absorbing centuries of Eastern technological breakthroughs. He took the Eastern concept of movable type, which had been traveling along the Silk Road for decades, and he simply adapted it to European conditions. He didn't invent the press. He took a heavy wooden screw press, a machine that had been used for centuries in Europe to crush grapes for wine and olives for oil, and he repurposed it. He took the Eastern concept of movable type, cast it in a lead-based alloy, and combined the two. Gutenberg was a brilliant mechanic. He was a clever adapter, but he was not the father of the information age. He was simply the man who successfully localized and imported Eastern technology for a European market. But that is not how the West wrote the history. And they decided that a tool this incredibly powerful, a machine that was actively reshaping the globe, could only have a Western origin story. They built an impenetrable, monolithic mythology around Johannes Gutenberg. They erected massive bronze statues of him in town squares across Germany. They named universities and libraries after him. They printed endless volumes of encyclopedias, using the very technology they absorbed from the East, that officially declared him the sole, undisputed inventor of the printing press. They framed 1440 as year zero of the information age. Why did they lie? Because admitting the truth would completely shatter the foundational myth of the European Renaissance. The entire Western historical narrative relies heavily on the idea that Europe woke up from the Dark Ages through its own inherent, superior, isolated genius. They needed the world to believe that Western science, Western religion, and Western engineering were the natural engines of human progress. If they admitted that the absolute catalyst for the modern world, the machine that actually allowed them to spread their ideas and leave the Middle Ages behind, was a Chinese and Korean invention, the illusion of Western supremacy would completely collapse. It would prove that Europe was not the leader of human innovation, but a delayed student, finally catching up to what the East had perfected centuries earlier. So, they did what empires always do. They controlled the narrative. They simply erased Bi Sheng. They erased the Buddhist monks of the Tang dynasty. They erased the master metallurgists of the Goryeo dynasty. They looked at the absolute, undeniable physical evidence of the East, and they chose to write it out of the curriculum. This is not just a case of innocent parallel invention. This is a case of deliberate chronological theft. Think about the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the Gutenberg Illusion. For over 400 years, the Western education system has looked generations of students directly in the eye and taught them a timeline that is mathematically, physically, and historically false. Even today, if you walk into the National Library of France and look at the Jikji, the oldest surviving book printed with cast metal movable type, printed 68 years before the Gutenberg Bible, Western historians will still try to minimize it. They will use sterile, academic language to protect the European myth. They will call the Korean achievement a regional anomaly or an isolated experiment. They will bend over backward to ensure that the word inventor remains permanently attached to a German blacksmith. But the buried record demands intellectual justice. The East did not just experiment. They built a fully functioning, thriving publishing industry centuries before Europe figured out how to press ink onto paper without doing it by hand. And here is the ultimate, sickening irony of the 400-year cover-up. The West used the printing press to colonize the globe, both physically and intellectually. They used it to print the maps that divided up the continents of Africa and Asia. They used it to print the colonial edicts that stripped indigenous populations of their land. They used it to mass-produce the very textbooks that declared Eastern civilizations to be primitive, stagnant, and backwards. They used an Eastern invention to print the very books that erased Eastern history. This is the deadliest form of historical bias. It is intellectual colonialism. When you control the press, you control the timeline. And the West used the press to write a timeline where they were the sole, brilliant protagonists of the human story, while reducing the actual inventors of the technology to silent, irrelevant footnotes. We are taught that the modern world was built on Western innovation. We are told that the information age is a uniquely European and American triumph. But the tool that recorded that history, the machine that made the modern world possible, was an Eastern invention. The information age wasn't born in a workshop in mines. It was born in the temples of Chongju and the artisan districts of Hangzhou. History is written by the victors, but the machine they used to print that history was stolen. The next time someone tells you that Johannes Gutenberg single-handedly invented the printing press and dragged humanity into the light, remember the Diamond Sutra. Remember the fired clay type of Bi Sheng. Remember the meticulously cast bronze characters of the Jikji. Do not let the West take credit for the sunrise just because they finally woke up to see it. Everything you just heard is documented. It is in the archaeological archives. The dates are undeniable. The Jikji is sitting in a museum right now, defying the Western timeline. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is, why weren't you taught this? If this changed how you see the history of human communication, share it with someone who needs to hear this. And if you want to go deeper, the buried record has a lot more to reveal. Subscribe, and we